She was 18 years old, and she had $1 and a library card when she entered the winning bid on a county surplus listing on a Thursday evening, sitting in the library parking lot in her car because the Wi-Fi reached that far, and she had nowhere else to be. The property was an 1887 private railroad car on a siding in the town of Kellner Junction, roughly 60 miles from the place where Willa Dodd had grown up, and it had been sitting there for 81 years. The county had acquired it from a bankrupt railroad holding company decades earlier and had never found a use for it. The car went to surplus at a $1 opening bid, and Willa was the only person who entered a number. She owed $212 in title transfer fees before legal possession would pass to her, which she earned over 9 days of yard work and odd jobs for families in Kellner Junction while sleeping in her car in the town park lot. When the county clerk finally accepted her payment and handed her the title, she walked to the rail siding and put her hand on the car and stood there for a long time. What she would find inside the hidden compartment behind the parlor wall of that car, sealed for 81 years and never once discovered, would change everything she had been told about what she deserved. If you're settling in for this one, I hope you'll stay. Hitting subscribe keeps these stories coming and only takes a moment. Drop something in the comments. I always want to know where you're watching from. Now, back to Willa. Willa Dodd's father had worked on the railroad for 20 years, not in an office, with his hands on the equipment, doing the kind of maintenance work that keeps heavy machinery functional and that most people never think about until it fails. He had loved trains in the particular way of someone whose love is practical and informed, who sees beauty in something and also understands exactly how it works. When Willa was young, 7, 8, 9 years old, he would sometimes drive her through Kellner Junction on the way back from errands and slow the truck when they passed the rail siding. He would point to the car, long, dark-sided, sitting alone on its length of track with the weeds growing up around the wheels. He called it the ghost car. He told her about Pullman cars and private rail travel, about the Gilded Age when wealthy men had their own rolling palaces and crossed the country in them. He told her that the car on that siding had belonged to a railroad executive back in the 1880s and that nobody had done anything with it in longer than either of them had been alive. She had forgotten this, or thought she had. Her father died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October, when Willa was 16. He was 53 years old. He was alone when it happened. Willa was at school and she was called to the office at noon, and a woman she didn't know drove her to the hospital, and by the time she got there, it was already over. She sat in a waiting room chair for a long time before anyone came to get her. She had the particular experience of understanding something completely while also being unable to fully take it in, the way a very cold thing numbs you before it begins to hurt. Her father had been married to Noreen for 4 years. Noreen had 2 children of her own from a first marriage, both grown, both closer to her than to Willa's father, who had been quiet and careful and had never pushed. The house was her father's. He had bought it before the marriage, before Willa was born, with money he had saved for the better part of a decade. He had a will, a simple typed document drawn up years earlier, that left the house and its contents to Willa in the event of his death. Noreen's attorney filed a contest within the week. The argument was complex, and Willa understood only the general shape of it, that the will predated the marriage, that Noreen had contributed to the household and had a reasonable expectation of inheritance, that the document was not sufficient to disinherit a spouse under state law. The case went to probate court. It moved slowly, the way such cases move, and in the meantime, Willa continued to live in her childhood home under a set of arrangements that felt less like living and more like waiting. She paid no rent. She was not asked to. But Noreen's presence in the house had a quality that Willa learned to navigate the way you learn to navigate a room where the furniture has been rearranged in the dark, carefully, without complaint, expecting a collision. She finished high school. She got a job at a grocery store. She put money in a jar, and she kept the jar in the zippered pocket at the bottom of her bag, where she had always kept the things she could not afford to lose. She got herself to school every morning and to work 3 evenings a week, and she maintained the surface of a normal life, with the precision of someone who has learned that you have to keep the surface intact, or people will try to intervene, and intervention is expensive. She did not let herself think too much about the court case, because thinking about it used energy she needed for other things. The ruling came down on a Thursday in June, when Willa was 18 and 1 month. She sat in the courtroom gallery beside her father's sister, who had driven 4 hours to be there, and who held Willa's hand through the reading of the decision. Noreen won. The reasoning was detailed and legal, and Willa followed enough of it to understand that the outcome was technically defensible, which made it worse in a way she could not fully articulate. What she remembered afterward was not the judge's words. It was the moment the decision was read, when Noreen turned to her elder daughter, who was sitting beside her, and for a fraction of a second, before her expression settled back into something appropriate, she smiled. A quick, private, satisfied smile, the kind that is not meant to be seen. Willa saw it from across the room. She moved out within the month. Noreen offered 30 days, and Willa took 20. Because staying was harder than leaving. She had $460 saved, and her car, and a bag of clothes, and her father's old field jacket, which was the one thing she had specifically asked Noreen if she could take, and which Noreen had said, after a brief pause, yes. She spent 6 weeks on a friend's couch, and then 3 weeks in a motel, paying by the week until the money ran out. She moved into her car in August. She kept the grocery store job and started taking every extra shift she could get, eating at the store on her breaks, using the library to shower in the sink on mornings she could get in early before the staff arrived. She was not the first person who had figured this out, and the library staff was not unkind about it. She found Wi-Fi where she could. She slept in the car with the seat reclined and her father's jacket over her shoulders. It was September when she saw the listing. She was in the library parking lot at 9 in the evening, working through county surplus property records because she had been doing this for 2 months, checking them every few days, looking for something, not knowing exactly what. She had been thinking in a way she could not quite organize into a plan yet. About property, about how to get a fixed address, about the difference between surviving and building something. She was 18 years old. She was working 32 hours a week at a grocery store and sleeping in her car. She did not have a plan. She had a direction. The listing was there when she searched for Kellner Junction. She almost skipped past it. A railroad car. $1 opening bid. Minimum title transfer fee of $212. She looked at the address. She looked at it for a long time. She knew that address. Not from the listing, from a truck window. On a Tuesday afternoon when she was 9 years old, with her father's hand pointing at something long and dark on a rail siding and his voice saying, "Ghost car. Willa, that's what's left of the way things used to be." She put in her $1. She drove to Kellner Junction the next morning and walked the rail siding before anyone knew she was in town. The car was just as she remembered it and entirely different. Longer than her memory had made it, and lower, settled into the siding as though it had grown roots. The dark paint had faded and peeled. The wheels were solid with rust. Weeds came up through the ballast to the wheel flanges, but the car itself, she walked around it with her hands in her father's jacket pockets, and she looked at it with the eyes she had inherited from him. the eye that sees the structure beneath the condition. The car itself was sound. The steel underframe was intact. The body panels were steel over wood, and the wood had not given way. The clerestory windows along the roofline were intact. Dirty, some cracked, but sealed. The car had been built to last 100 years. It had lasted 136 and was still standing. She found the county clerk the following morning. His name was Hector, and he was perhaps 60. A precise man who wore the same kind of reading glasses her father's sister wore, and who looked at her across the counter with the careful expression of someone who is waiting to be surprised and is not sure how he feels about it. "You're the bidder," he said. "I am," she said. He looked at her once, completely, the way experienced bureaucrats sometimes look at people when they are forming a judgment. Then he explained the process, the $212 fee, the timeline, the fact that the land under the car was town property, and that she would need a separate ground use agreement with the town council. "The council meets next Tuesday," he said. "I can put you on the agenda." He put her on the agenda. She went to the grocery store and called her manager and asked for every hour available for the next 2 weeks, and the manager, a woman named Pat, who had watched Willa work for 8 months and had a clear sense of what she was doing with the money, gave her the hours without asking why. 9 days later, she paid the fee. She had met, in those 9 days, a woman named Bess Crane, who had stopped to watch her raking leaves at the Hendersons' house on Maple Street, and who had said, with the directness of someone who has given up the pretense of small talk, "You're the girl who bought the old car." Bess was 79. She had grown up in Kellner Junction. Her family had been in the town since the railroad was running, and she kept the town's unofficial history in her memory the way other people keep it in books, precisely with citations, and with strong opinions about which versions were accurate and which were not. She had known about that car her entire life. "Come see me when you have the title," she said. "I'll tell you what I know." The town council approved a ground use agreement at $5 per year, which the council member who moved the vote described as nominal in consideration of the preservation value the new owner represents. The phrase had been suggested, Willa learned later, by Hector. He had a quiet way of making things possible, without drawing attention to the making. She climbed into the car for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in October, through the rear observation platform door, which she pried open with a flat bar borrowed from the hardware store. The air inside was cold and still and smelled of aged wood and something Willa associated immediately and without any explanation she could give with her father. Something dry and faintly sweet. The ghost of pipe tobacco, perhaps, or simply the smell of a man's private space, kept closed for a very long time. The parlor was at the front of the car, past a narrow corridor. It ran the full width of the car and was paneled in rosewood and mahogany, carved and fitted with a craftsmanship she had seen only in photographs. The bench seating was upholstered in velvet, faded from burgundy to a pale and dusty rose, but intact. The wood was dark with age and covered in a fine layer of dust, but when she ran her hand along the wainscoting she could feel the quality of it, the density, the precision of the joinery, the way it had been made with an intention toward permanence. The ceiling was pressed tin, painted over in cream, still holding. The clerestory windows above let in a thin gray October light. She sat on the bench seat for a while and looked at the room. She had been sleeping in a car for 6 weeks. Now she was sitting in a different car, one built before her great-grandparents were born, and it felt, strange as this was to think, like the beginning of something that made sense. She slept in the car that night, on the bench seat, wrapped in her father's jacket. She had been sleeping in her Civic for 6 weeks, with the seat reclined and her feet pressed against the passenger door, and the bench seat of the parlor, even dusty, even hard through its thinned cushioning, was longer than she was. She lay on her back and watched the stars through the clerestory windows, pale through the dirty glass, and she thought about her father pointing at this car from a truck window when she was 9 years old. She thought about the smell inside it, that dry, sweet smell that was not anything she could name but that made her feel, unreasonably, less alone. She slept better than she had in months. She woke up before the light and lay still and listened to the early sounds of Kellner Junction coming alive outside. I want to stop here for just a moment. If you're staying with this story, subscribing is how you make sure the next one finds you too. It takes a second and it means more than you'd expect. Leave something in the comments as well. I read every one. Now, what she found in the walls. She found it on the third day. She had been cleaning methodically, working from the back of the car forward, taking inventory, learning the space, and she had the habit, which she had picked up from watching her father work, of tapping structural elements as she went. Testing. Listening to what the material said back to her. She had been tapping along the wainscoting in the parlor when she found the section that sounded different. She stopped. She went back to it, pressed her ear close, and tapped again. Where the rest of the paneling returned a solid sound, this section, roughly 18 inches wide, centered at shoulder height between two carved pilasters, gave back a hollow note. Shallow, but distinct. She examined the carving. The molding was more elaborate here than anywhere else in the parlor. A repeating pattern of oak leaves and acorns, very precise, and in the center of the section, slightly larger than the rest, a carved boss in the shape of a locomotive wheel. She pressed it. Nothing. She pressed it and turned it. A click. The panel swung inward an inch. She did not move for several seconds. Then she got her flashlight and opened it the rest of the way. The compartment behind the panel was perhaps 24 inches wide and 30 inches deep, lined in dark fabric that had once been velvet and had become something between velvet and dust. On a narrow shelf at the back sat a wooden case, perhaps the size of a shoebox, with brass fittings. Beside it, a leather portfolio, its cover dried and cracked with age, but its strap still buckled. And behind both of these, slotted into a groove at the back of the compartment, as though placed there as an afterthought, an envelope. Sealed, yellowed, written on in ink. She read the name on the front. Ida. She brought everything out carefully, one piece at a time, and set it on the bench seat in the gray light coming through the clerestory windows. She opened the wooden case first. Inside, in the remains of velvet lining, a gold pocket watch, the case engraved with initials and a small locomotive, still ticking when she wound it. 2 cameo brooches set in gold frames, a strand of pearls, each one still faintly lustrous beneath the surface grime, and in a smaller compartment within the case, nestled in chamois, 3 oval portrait miniatures framed in gold, each one showing a face. A man, a woman, a girl of perhaps 12. She opened the leather portfolio next. It held certificates, 67 of them, she counted. Each one a rectangle of heavy paper printed in elaborate Victorian style with allegorical figures and ornate borders, and the names of railroad companies she did not entirely recognize. Issued in various years from 1884 to 1911, signed in ink that had faded to the color of old rust. Railroad stock certificates. She held one up to the light and looked at the printing, eagles and goddesses, and the careful engraved hatching of a craftsman who had taken his work seriously, and she thought that even without any financial value these were extraordinary objects. The kind of thing people put in frames. She did not open the envelope. Not yet. She sat on the bench seat in her father's jacket, with the watch in one hand and the envelope in the other, and she looked at the name written on the front, and she thought about a girl named Ida, and about a father who had put these things in a hidden place and sealed a letter and apparently never delivered it, and about all the years since then. She went to see Bess. Bess lived 4 blocks from the rail siding in a house that smelled of old books and good coffee, and was so full of Kellner Junction's accumulated history that navigating it required a kind of documentary fluency. She looked at the photograph Willa had taken of the compartment's contents on her phone, and then she looked at Willa, and she sat down. "Elias Crane," she said. "That's his car. That's been his car the whole time." She told Willa what she knew. Elias Crane had been a regional railroad executive, not one of the great names, not Vanderbilt or Gould, but a substantial man in a smaller pond who had built and operated the Crane and Western Rail Company across 3 counties from the 1870s to the 1900s. He had commissioned the private car in 1887 as a working office and personal conveyance and had used it for 30 years. He had a daughter named Ida. He died in 1928 at 76, and his estate had been complicated. The company was in decline by then. The automobile was winning, and the legal process of winding things down had been protracted. The car had ended up stranded on the Kellner Junction siding through a combination of contested ownership claims and simple neglect, and there it had stayed. Ida survived him by 30 years, Bess said. She died in 1958. She never lived in Kellner Junction. She had moved away by the time the estate was settled. She probably never knew the car was still here. She paused. She certainly never came to look. Willa held the envelope. "Open it," Bess said. The letter inside was written on paper that carried, at the top, the letterhead of the Crane and Western Rail Company, the company name in raised print, and below it a small engraved illustration of the private car itself. The date was November 12th, 1927, 1 year before Elias died. He had written to Ida in the careful, old-fashioned hand of a man who had spent his life corresponding by letter and knew what a letter was for. He told her about the compartment, the carved panel, the locomotive wheel boss, the way the mechanism worked. He told her about the contents, the watch, which had been his father's, which he wanted her to have, the jewelry, which had been her mother's, the miniature portraits, which he had commissioned in 1889, and which he said he hoped she would keep together, the stock certificates, which represented holdings in several companies that had since consolidated or been absorbed, and which he believed a financial specialist could determine the current value of, if any. He told her he was sorry he hadn't found a way to speak of this in person, that it had seemed easier to write it down. He said he loved her. He said he was proud of her. He said, "The car is yours, Ida. It has always been yours. Take whatever is inside it and take good care of yourself." He had written this, sealed it, placed it in the compartment, and apparently died without ever sending it or telling her where to look. Willa sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about a father who had prepared something for his daughter and run out of time to deliver it. She thought about the watch ticking in the wooden case, keeping time for 81 years in the dark, waiting for someone who was never going to come. She thought about Ida, who had lived her whole long life without knowing any of this was here, and who had died 40 years before Willa was born. She thought about her own father, who had pointed at this car from a truck window and called it the ghost car, and had not known, could not have known, that his daughter would end up sitting inside it, one cold October, with her hands in his jacket. She had not cried yet, not since the probate court. She had been too busy surviving to cry. She cried now, in Bess's kitchen, in a way she did not try to stop, and Bess poured more coffee and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. A Scripophily dealer in the state capital, the specialty is the collection and valuation of antique financial documents, drove down to Kellner Junction the following month after Willa sent photographs of the certificate portfolio. He spent 2 hours at the bench seat of the parlor, with his reference materials and his magnifying glass, examining each of the 67 certificates with unhurried attention. He was a small, methodical man who explained what he found as he worked. Some certificates were from lines that had been absorbed into larger companies at various points, and the absorption records would need research to determine if any residual claims remained active. Others were from lines that had simply ceased to exist. The certificates themselves, however, regardless of any underlying value, were collectible objects in their own right. Beautifully printed, well preserved, genuinely rare. He made an offer on the collection as objects alone, $31,000. She said she needed a week to think. She consulted Hector. Hector consulted a retired attorney he knew. The consensus was that given the age of the certificates, the dissolution of the original companies, and the legal complexity of Ida Crane's estate, since Ida had died intestate and with no living descendants, any underlying financial claim was almost certainly unenforceable. But the objects themselves, as found property recovered from a vehicle she legally owned, were hers. She accepted the dealer's offer. The pocket watch she took to a horological specialist in the city. Elias's gold railroad watch, in working condition, with original provenance documentation she assembled from Bess's records, was appraised at $4,200. She did not sell it. She kept it on the shelf in the parlor, wound once a week, ticking. She had been corresponding since October with a railroad preservation organization that had learned of the car's existence through a brief mention in the county clerk's public records. They sent a representative in November, a man named Gordon, well-dressed. Clearly someone who had spent his career in the company of old machines and loved them as Willa's father had loved them, for what they were and for how they worked. He walked through the cars slowly, running his gloved hands along the rosewood panels, examining the pressed tin ceiling, crouching to look at the underframe. He was quiet for most of it. When he came back up through the rear platform, he stood looking at the car from the outside for a while. "This is one of the best preserved examples of its type in the country," he said. He said it carefully, like someone who rarely gets to say a thing like that. He made a proposal. The organization would fund the full restoration of the car, a project he estimated at $240,000, in exchange for a 20-year agreement in which the car would be made available for preservation exhibits and educational programs for a portion of each year. Willa would retain ownership and full use of the car for the remaining time. She would receive a stewardship stipend of $14,000 annually for the duration of the agreement. She asked for 2 weeks to think. She took 3. Then she signed. Kellner Junction learned about all of it gradually, in the way small towns learn things, through Bess, through Hector, through the hardware store where Willa had bought most of her supplies. The response was the particular warm curiosity of a community that has been watching an old thing come back to life and has decided to take some of the credit. Lou at the hardware store started giving her a discount without being asked. The woman at the diner 2 blocks from the siding began setting aside day-old bread and leaving it in a bag on the rear platform step. Bess came by most mornings with coffee and history. She told Willa more about Elias Crane, about what the car had meant to the town, about the Depression years when the car sat empty on the siding and the doors were never locked, and it was understood, not formally, not announced anywhere, that anyone who needed to sleep out of the cold was welcome to use it. Families had spent nights in that parlor. People had cooked small meals on a portable stove set on the observation platform. The town had looked the other way and called it looking after the car. She told Willa more about Elias Crane, about what the car had meant to the town, about the Depression years, when the car sat empty on the siding and the doors were never locked, and it was understood, not formally, not announced anywhere, that anyone who needed to sleep out of the cold was welcome to use it. Families had spent nights in that parlor. People had cooked small meals on a portable stove set on the observation platform. The town had looked the other way and called it looking after the car. There was a woman, Bess said, who had lived in the car for 6 weeks in the winter of 1933 with 2 small children, while her husband was away looking for work. The woman had told this story for the rest of her long life. She had never known whose car it was, only that it was warm and that no one had come to move her on. Elias always said the car was meant to carry people, not just property, Bess said. She said it matter-of-factly, as though it were something she had said before and expected to say again. Willa thought about this for a long time. She ordered a small cast-iron wood stove and had it installed on the observation platform with a proper flue, within code, and with Hector's blessing, which came after 2 phone calls and a form she filled out correctly on the first attempt. She wrote a note on a piece of cardboard and taped it to the rear door, where anyone on the siding path could see it. Always warm inside. She did not put her name on it. Noreen sent a text message in December. It was brief and carefully worded in the manner of someone who wants to appear concerned without committing to anything. That she had heard Willa was doing something interesting with an old train. That she hoped she was well. That she was around if Willa ever wanted to talk. Willa read it once. She set the phone face down on the bench seat. She went back to cleaning the pressed tin on the ceiling with a soft cloth and a solution Bess had found in a reference book on historic metalwork, working from the center outward in slow circular motions, the way the book recommended. The tin came back to cream. She kept working. She turned 19 in February. Bess brought a cake, and Hector came by, and Gordon sent a card from the Preservation Society, and Willa stood on the observation platform in her father's jacket and looked out at the Kellner Junction rail yard in the early winter light and thought about what it means to be given something you weren't expecting by someone who is gone. Her father had pointed at this car from a truck window and called it the ghost car. He had said it with the particular wistfulness of a man who loves something from a distance, because it is not his and never will be. He had not known that one day his daughter would sit in it, that she would sleep in it and clean it and find the compartment that had been closed for 81 years and open an old man's letter to his daughter and cry in a stranger's kitchen over the distance between what people mean to leave behind and what actually gets delivered. She had been homeless at 18, and she had spent $1 and 9 days of work, and she had found, on a rail siding in a town her father had always loved, something she could not have planned for, and something she could not have found any other way. Proof that some things are preserved by the simple act of being left alone to wait for the right person. That some things keep their value in the dark, untouched, for as long as it takes. The car was meant to carry people, not just property. She understood that now. She was carrying it forward. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll subscribe. It keeps these coming, and it means more than you'd think. And I'd love to know, was there ever a place, a building, a vehicle, a stretch of road that connected you to someone you had lost? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. See you in the next one.